On the 9th of November 1961, in the sleepy seaside town of Weston-super-Mare, a woman named Winifred went into labor. Her husband Jack rushed to Ashcombe House maternity home and was at his wife's side as she gave birth to their one and only daughter. They would name her Jill Wendy Dando. Jill's early years were an uphill struggle. When she was just 3 years old, it was discovered that she had a blocked pulmonary artery, as well as a hole in her tiny heart. The pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs, where it will be loaded up with oxygen again before circulating the body. Unless the blockage was cleared, the infant Jill's lungs would be unable to form even the most basic of functions. Her young life was in grave danger, but thanks to the budding National Health Service, the infant Jill was taken care of. Doctors from all over the former British Empire took part in the delicate operation to set up and unblock her tiny, still-beating heart. The operation was a complete success, and Jill grew up to be a healthy, happy girl. After her comprehensive education, Jill went on to study journalism at the South Glamorgan Institute of Higher Education in nearby Cardiff, Wales. It was there she would be filled with a passion for dramatics and media, taking part in local amateur dramatics and theater companies, and even volunteering for Sunshine Hospital Radio, a non-profit organization that wished to bring a little ray of sunshine into the lives of sick and injured patients. It appears that Jill never, ever forgot the debt she owed to her nation's medical professionals. Journalism was something of a family business for the Dandos. Jill's father and brother worked for the local weekly newspaper, the Weston Mercury, and this is where Jill found her first paid reporter's job. For 5 whole years she worked as a print journalist for the Mercury, covering the community events and helping to promote local and regional business. But Jill always knew she was destined for the big time. So in 1985, when the call came from the British Broadcasting Corporation that they were looking for a newsreader for BBC Radio Devon, Jill jumped at the chance, beat out her male competitors, and secured her place on the next highest rung on the media ladder. Her meteoric rise was simply unstoppable. Dando was fresh-faced, enthusiastic, intelligent, and beautiful. She exuded the girl-next-door type of vibe that her listeners found endearing and informative. She was media dynamite, so naturally it didn't take long for her to transition from local radio to local television and then onto national television. The bright-eyed young blonde from Somerset packed her bags and made the journey from her small, humble seaside home to the big lights of London. She had finally made it. After brief stints on breakfast TV and nightly news programs, Jill managed to land a more casual, more personal role as the presenter of the holiday program. It was this job that gained Dando most of her fame and public affection. Each week, viewers would tune in and join Jill on whichever sun-soaked adventure she was on. Island hopping in the crisp blue Aegean Sea, hiking in the baking Spanish Sierras, or feasting on all the culinary delights that Italy had to offer, the British public lived almost vicariously through the woman they felt as if they knew personally. So much of Dando's politeness, her lust for life, her Britishness shone through in ways that had the British people falling head over heels for her. She was a devout Baptist, and her wholesomeness earned her guest presenting spots on BBC's Songs of Praise, a religious program that presents Christian hymns sung in churches of varying denominations from around the UK. But it was in 1995 that Dando landed the role that would, without a doubt, have the biggest effect on her life. 10 years prior, BBC directors were racking their brains for new ideas on new, fresh entertainment. A new German TV show called Achtenzeichen XY Ungelost was taking the continental airwaves by storm. On the show, law enforcement officials as well as media personalities would appeal to the general public for information on unsolved crimes. This actually helped to put a few dangerous German fugitives behind bars, and this was celebrated on the show with presenters thanking the public for their assistance. It was a national phenomenon, and soon plans were in the works for a British version of the show that would simply be called Crime Watch UK. So when a female presenter's position opened up on the show, Dando once again found herself on primetime television. The wholesome girl next door, who was already adored by the public, was now a symbol of hope and justice to the criminally victimized. Before she was adored, but now she was the nation's darling, perhaps the biggest female televisual persona in British history. She had seemingly fulfilled her lifelong destiny, but tragedy was right around the corner. On the morning of April 26, 1999, the then 37-year-old Jill Dando left her partner's home in Chiswick, West London, and traveled home by far to her house in Fulham, just over 3 miles away. It is important to note that Dando did not visit this Fulham home often. She was in the process of selling the home to move in with her partner, Alan Farthing, and he was generally only present at the address to pick up odd personal items and to meet the estate agents. As Jill reached the front door of the house at around 11:32 a.m., a single shot rang out around the neighborhood. Jill collapsed to the floor as blood pooled beneath her, her life draining away. Less than 15 minutes later, a neighbor by the name of Helen Doble was walking along the street when she saw the fallen Dando lying in a substantial puddle of her own blood. In records of the 999 call that Doble made to the police, her voice can be heard breaking up. Quivering, the realization hits her that the nation's darling had been murdered on her doorstep of her own home. Doble describes the huge amount of blood at the scene, responding to the dispatcher's questions about vital signs with, "I don't think she's breathing anymore. Oh God, her lips are blue. I think she's dead." Police and ambulance crews arrived on scene just before noon, but it was too late. Dando was declared dead on arrival at 1:03 p.m. when her body arrived at Charing Cross Hospital. The nation went into mourning. There was intense media coverage of the murder. The people were outraged, furious that such a heartless act could have been perpetrated against someone who had only ever worked for the public's good. It was barely 24 hours before details of the murder began to emerge, and just weeks later, Jill's murder was reconstructed on her own show, Crime Watch, in the hope that the public could help bring her killer to justice. In a special edition of the TV show, the results of the Metropolitan Police forensic study was shared with viewers. Dando had been shot by a single bullet from a 9mm pistol, pressed right up against her temple the moment the weapon was fired. Richard Hughes, another one of her next-door neighbors, heard Dando exclaim something, a surprised cry like someone greeting a friend, but did not hear the shot fired. He claimed he looked out of his front window and saw a tall Caucasian man, aged around 40, rapidly walking down from Dando's house. Investigative journalist Bob Wolfenden reported the following. As Dando was about to put her keys in the lock to open the front door of her home in Fulham, she was grabbed from behind. With his right arm, the assailant held her and forced her to the ground, so that her face was almost touching the tiled step of the porch. Then, with his left hand, he fired a single shot at her temple, killing her instantly. The bullet entered her head just above her ear, parallel to the ground, and came out the right side of her head. The details of the case were harrowing, and the British public angrily demanded justice, but the subsequent investigation came up against a few problems. Firstly, Dando was a well-known television personality who was known to millions upon millions of people. Naturally, there was a great deal of speculation regarding the motives for her murder, which led to literally thousands of people being interviewed by police, with over 1,000 lengthy written statements taken from the interviewees. Initially, theories surfaced that a jealous lover or ex-partner had murdered Dando, but interviews with friends and family, as well as phone records investigated by police, quickly ruled this out. Some investigators even suggested that this could have been a case of mistaken identity, but the fact that the murder occurred on the doorstep of her home eliminated this as a possibility. It was even thought that a business rival or an ex-colleague with a grudge could be to blame. This line of inquiry was not so easily dismissed by investigators, given Dando's exceptionally successful career. When her former agent, John Roseman, was questioned by the police, he was horrified to learn that he was being interviewed under caution. Effectively, he'd found himself as a suspect of his former client's murder. However, Much to his relief, nothing suspicious was found, and he was never again part of the investigation. The most likely theory that the Metropolitan Police entertained was that the murder was committed by an obsessive or mentally deranged fan of Dando's. Jill was known to politely decline any invitations of marriage from male admirers. It could be the case that one had taken her well-mannered rejection just a little too hard. This idea was only cemented when Jill's brother and fellow journalist Nigel had informed police investigators that she had become increasingly concerned by some guy who was pestering her in the final few days before her murder. When Nigel's claim was investigated by detectives, they made a horrifying discovery. A short walk away from Jill Dando's Fulham home, less than half a mile away from the place she was murdered, lived a man named Barry George. Barry George was a highly disturbed individual, often giving false names to those he met. In 1980, he was convicted and fined for impersonating a policeman, having obtained false identification after a failed attempt to join the force for real. At his court appearance, George eschewed the usual suit and tie in favor of glam rock attire, and falsely stated his name as Paul Gadd, the real name of convicted child deviant Gary Glitter. Around the same time, he was exposed by a local newspaper when he claimed to be the winner of the British Karate Championship, his tale unraveling when the real champion soon stepped forward to expose him as a charlatan. These were all fairly light-hearted offenses, but they preceded darker crimes that would expose Barry George as the vile psychopath he is. In 1981, after adopting the persona of a Special Forces operative, George was charged with 2 counts of indecent assault. He was found not guilty of one charge, but a conviction for the other assault resulted in a suspended prison sentence of 3 months. 2 years later, Barry George once again found himself before a judge, this time for attempting to force himself upon a woman in Acton, West London. He was found guilty and served just half of a 33 months prison sentence. But these were not isolated incidents. His 1989 marriage to a Japanese student by the name of Itsuko Toida ended less than a year after it began. Toida went on to describe her ex-husband as terrifying and violent, a man with a fractured personal identity who could fly into a rage at any perceived slight. She also confessed he has assaulted her on numerous occasions just months into their new marriage. It is Barry George's lengthy criminal history that led him to become the subject of such intense police investigation. He was soon put under surveillance after details of his previous offenses emerged. When it became apparent that George was trying to lie low, only leaving his residence at night and displaying paranoid behavior, police swept in for the arrest. During his trial, the prosecution leveled 4 serious accusations against George. Firstly, police had noticed some glaring inconsistencies in George's statement and accused him of lying to cover his involvement. It was also alleged that George has attempted to create a false alibi. Police also brought out a witness that claimed to have seen Barry George hastily leaving the area. Finally, the prosecution brought up the fact that a single particle of firearm discharge residue had been found on an item of George's clothing a full year after the murder. This proved that George was knowledgeable of firearms and had access to firearms. On July 2, 2001, at the Old Bailey in London, a jury of his peers convicted Barry George guilty of the murder of Jill Dando by 10 votes to 1 before a judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. But the story doesn't end here. Concern regarding George's conviction was widespread, with many arguing that the case against him was purely circumstantial. Evidence from 3 people placed Barry George's arrival at their disability offices at around noon on the day of the murder, which would have made it impossible for him to have shot Jill Dando outside of her house at 11:30 and then gone home to change before his appointment at the disability office. What's more, 2 neighbors who almost certainly saw the murderer immediately after the shooting had taken place had failed to properly identify Barry George at subsequent identity parades. 2 appeals were unsuccessful, but after discredited forensics evidence was excluded from the prosecution's case, George's 3rd appeal succeeded in November of 2007. The original conviction was quashed, and the second trial lasting 8 weeks ended in George's acquittal on the 1st of August 2008. Barry George was officially cleared of Jill Dando's murder. But if such a violent, deranged fantasist didn't kill her, just exactly who did? The police had rolled out theories of a contract killing by the time that they had begun to investigate Barry George. Forensic examination of the shell casing and bullet recovered from the murder scene suggested that the killer's pistol had been a replica or a decommissioned gun, the result of a workshop conversion that had turned a harmless imitation into a real working firearm. It was initially argued that a professional hitman would never use such an unreliable weapon of such poor quality. This led to police focusing on the idea that the murder had been committed by a crazed opportunist who was working alone, which naturally pointed them towards Barry George. But in the years following Barry George's release, additional details on the murder weapon have emerged. For example, it only recently came to the public's attention that the single bullet fired by Dando's murderer had also been tampered with. Someone had separated the round from its casing, removed a considerable amount of the gunpowder propellant before reassembling the bullet itself. This means that although the lack of propellant would make for a much less lethal round when it was fired, it would be much quieter than a regular bullet. This would enable the murderer to kill Dando on her own doorstep in broad daylight without any potential witnesses hearing the shot. And that is exactly what happened. As mentioned previously, when a neighbor of Dando's heard her surprised cry, but heard no shots fired. So how exactly, in light of such disturbing, revealing information, are police so sure that it wasn't a hitman? In fact, I'd go so far as to say that such information would indicate that it was exactly the work of a professional contract killer, one with an expert knowledge of ballistics and tradecraft that would commit such a brazen act without one single credible witness. But who exactly would have the resources and motive to hire or deploy their own assassin? In the mid-90s, the paramilitary rebel group Kosovo Liberation Army began to stage attacks against Serbian security services they claimed were occupying their homeland. This resulted in retaliatory attacks from Serbian armed forces who sought vengeance against the ragtag band of rebels. They targeted KLA sympathizers, but also used the attacks as an excuse to jail and murder political opponents to Serb dominance in the area. By the end of 1998, over 2,000 civilians and KLA fighters had been killed. Europe was aflame with outrage. All of NATO's attempts to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict failed miserably. Eventually, it was deemed that there were no other options beside direct military intervention. The aerial bombardment of Yugoslavia was about to begin. A coalition of 13 nations led by the United States and Great Britain began to bomb bridges, industrial plants, and Serbian military targets in what became known as Operation Merciful Angel, the aim being to break the back of the Serbian armed forces and reduce their ability to wage war in the region. On the evening of April 6, 1999, an allegiance of 12 British charities, including Oxfam and the Red Cross, launched a televised appeal for the victims of the Serbian aggression. Within an hour of the program's arising, thousands upon thousands of callers jammed telephones, donation hotlines, donating hundreds of thousands of pounds to the cause. The face of that campaign was none other than Jill Dando. In her typically warm, humble manner, Jill appealed to the British public to help stop the biggest humanitarian disaster in Europe since World War II. She tugged on the heartstrings of the nation, describing how just short of 1 million ethnic Albanians had been forced from their homes by heartless, hateful Serbs. The British public gave generously. Almost 3 weeks later, on the 24th of April, Allied warplanes were targeting communications infrastructure in the Serbian capital, Belgrade. The headquarters of the premier Serbian TV network RTS was listed as a military target, and 16 of their staff were killed when a single NATO missile struck the building. Many of the victims were trapped under rubble for days, only able to communicate using mobile phones. NATO command attempted to justify the bombing on 2 levels. Firstly, that it was essentially to destroy and degrade the command and control capabilities of the Serbian armed forces. Secondly, it was argued that the RTS headquarters was making a crucial contribution to the Serbian war effort by pumping out propaganda that fanned the flames of conflict against ethnic minority groups. But the Serbs took the attack personally. One of the RTS staff members killed in the airstrike was a female presenter who was well known and well liked by the general Serb populace. One could even argue that Allied airstrikes killed Serbia's equivalent to Jill Dando, and as you can imagine, that caused a fair amount of outrage. So is it credible that Jill Dando was murdered at the command of Serbian military or political leaders? It can be argued that the origin of such theories stem from a viewer of the televised charity appeal, who wrote into the BBC to complain that the program had been exceptionally biased against the Serbs. After all, there was absolutely no mention that the violence was instigated by the Kosovan Liberation Army, and not the Serbs themselves, who had the right to defend themselves. The days after Miss Dando was killed, it emerged that Tony Hall, then the BBC's head of news, now the corporation's director general, had been phoned by a man with an East European accent saying, "Your Prime Minister Blair butchered innocent young people. We butcher back." Barry George's own defense barrister Michael Mansfield was adamant that the Serbian warlord, known as Arkan, had ordered Dando assassinated in revenge for the bombing of the RTS headquarters. That her involvement in the appeal, the fact she was the public face of the campaign, made her a legitimate target in the eyes of angry Serbs. Shelko Arkan Rashnotovic was something of a cross between a military commander and career criminal. Despite the fact that he commanded the Serb volunteer guard, who he nicknamed the Tigers, he had made his name on Interpol's most wanted list for a number of robberies and murders he had committed throughout Europe. He had robbed banks in Sweden and Holland, had shootouts with police in Germany, and even escaped custody in Belgium as part of a daring prison break. There is no doubt that Arkan was nothing short of a criminal mastermind, and certainly had an extensive network of fellow crooks in almost every country around mainland Europe. It is not out of the question that he had the contacts and resources to have Jill Dando murdered, but it is not just Arkan who had such a shady past. The entire country of Yugoslavia, of which Serbia was a part of, had engaged in murky dealings. The country's former communist government had a history of targeted assassinations of its political opponents. These killings were generally carried out by hitmen working in pairs, a triggerman and a spotter, and were intricately planned. They had to be, since most of these assassinations took place as the target was either entering or leaving their own home. This was when the target was most vulnerable. It also reduced the chances of the target's identity being mistaken and the wrong person being killed. In fact, a Serbian opposition journalist was murdered outside of his own home just days before Jill Dando's death in an attack that was almost identical to the one she died in. Law enforcement would call such an attack a hard contact execution. Pressing the gun against a target's head before the shot is fired acts almost as a suppressor, not to mention the reduced noise from the tampered bullet. This act of close contact would also prevent the killer's clothing from being splattered with gore. UK Member of Parliament Patrick Mercer, who served with the British Army in Bosnia, would later state that Dando's murder had all the hallmarks of covert forces. He specifically cited the tailored ammunition used in the killing, explaining that it was Serbian trademark, something he had seen many times while he was serving in the region. It would have been possible to arrest and question Arkan to delve deeper into his potential involvement in Dando's murder, if it wasn't for his own assassination that occurred just over 6 months after she was killed. An off-duty police officer with ties to the Serbian mafia executed Arkan in the lobby of the Belgrade Intercontinental Hotel. It appears that although the Serbian connection may never be fully explored, there is plenty of credible evidence to suggest their involvement, yet it is not the only potential explanation for Dando's murder, and the other is arguably even darker and considerably more sinister. When the contract killing theory was dismissed by police in the initial aftermath of Jill Dando's murder, the Serbian connection was not the only idea that was cast aside. The other was that a contract killer had been hired by a criminal gang or some similar underworld organization. She was, after all, the feminine face of the show Crime Watch UK for a good chunk of her career, and doubtlessly contributed to putting countless criminals behind bars. Of course, it is possible that she was targeted for this reason, but it is unlikely. She was not the only host of the program, and she only joined as a presenter after the previous female host departed the Crime Watch team for pastures new. Silencing Dando would certainly not stop the show from airing, and as I mentioned earlier, Crime Watch even ran a special edition of the show which reconstructed the events of Dando's murder and urged members of the public to come forward with information. If her murder was an attempt to pull Crime Watch off the airwaves, it certainly failed. It also seems like an extremely harsh form of retribution to have a woman killed simply because she facilitated the capture of criminals. Crime Watch gleaned all of the information on its suspects directly from the police themselves. It's not like Dando had any exclusive information regarding any high-profile crimes, or so it seems. For in 2014, a close friend and former BBC colleague of Dando's went public with some pretty explosive information. Although they insisted on remaining anonymous with their claims, the source told that Dando had been approached with evidence that DJs, celebrities, and other BBC staff were involved in an organized ring trafficking children. Dando apparently took the allegations extremely seriously but was stunned when, according to the anonymous source, no one wanted to know of the concern she raised about the allegedly high-profile human trafficking ring. She is said to have compiled a file of evidence that she passed on to BBC's senior management, but nothing came of it. No investigation into the apparent abuse was undertaken. The same anonymous source stated that although she did not want to implicate anyone and risk her own safety, she recalled that there were some shockingly famous names and faces included in the accusations. She also related that information regarding how to join said network was freely available, and how Jill had received a number of complaints from female colleagues who also claimed to have been assaulted. But nothing was done. Their complaints weren't addressed. There seemed to be an unspoken policy of turning a blind eye, and we may know the reason for such a policy. Jimmy Savile. James Vincent Savile, an English DJ, radio and TV host who headed BBC shows including Top of the Pops and Jim Will Fix It. He was a prolific fundraiser for charitable institutions and raised approximately £40 million for the needy during his lifetime. But he was prolific in other ways too. Upon his death in 2011, hundreds upon hundreds of women came out of the woodwork to accuse Savile of serious abuse. Subsequent investigations led police to conclude that Savile had perhaps been the most active and predatory offender in British history, all under the guise of a kindly, albeit eccentric, philanthropist. But Savile could never have conducted such rampant abuses if not for the complacency or apathy of the government and charitable institutions he associated himself with. By late October 2012, the scandal had resulted in inquiries or reviews at the BBC, the National Health Service, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the Department of Health, all of which tried to work out just how Savile was able to remain undetected, or rather, how the children he abused came to be marginalized and ignored. But a minor inspection of Savile's credentials showed that he was a very well-connected man indeed. He was made a knight bachelor by the British royal family, granted a papal knighthood by Pope John Paul II, and even gifted a Cross of Merit by the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. There is absolutely no doubt that Savile used such influence to cover up the crimes that he and his companions committed. By 2012, when the extent of Savile's abuse had been revealed to the public, Jill's fellow BBC presenter and possible identity of the aforementioned anonymous source, Sally Jones, revealed that Savile had tried to kiss and inappropriately touch her in a chance elevator encounter in the late 80s. When she had related the story to Jill, she was surprised to find that Jill held the opinion that the venerated DJ was nothing more than a dirty old pervert. Where others turned a blind eye or covered up Savile's crimes, it appears that Jill had no qualms calling him out for what he really was. Sally Jones even related that Jill Dando herself had to fend off plenty of unwelcome advances. DJ Liz Kershaw and former Country File presenter Miriam O'Reilly have also both claimed they suffered harassment at the BBC in the 1980s. Could this have been at the hands of Jimmy Savile? Regardless, when Miss Dando joined a campaign to help children spot these type of predators the year before she died, she had received death threats, putting the BBC in lockdown, with armed guards patrolling Television Centre in London to protect one of their most valuable assets. Could Dando have been silenced by a group of covert abusers led by Savile himself? It would seem to account for the wall of silence that remained until Savile's death in 2011. One woman's life would be a small price to pay for the continual cover-up of 6 decades of abuse. Savile himself once said that he believed he would be able to square things away with the big man upon his death, alluding to the idea that the weight of his good deeds would balance the scales. This is commonly believed to be a reference to the predatory behavior he himself knew was evil, but it could allude to other crimes too. Crimes such as the suspicious death of Liz McKeon. Liz McKeon, the former British investigative reporter who exposed Jimmy Savile in the culture of abuse protection at the BBC, was just 52 when she was found dead. The BBC, who blocked her groundbreaking investigation from airing and spent the next few years attempting to destroy her reputation, reported that she died of complications from a stroke. Liz McKeon was the second high-profile BBC journalist to die in suspicious circumstances after attempting to expose the truth about this ring operating in the upper reaches of the establishment. Dando was the first. On May 21, 1999, at Ebden Road Cemetery, just 5 miles from where she was born, Jill Dando was laid to rest next to her late mother, who died of leukemia just 13 years earlier. Friends and colleagues spoke of her selfless nature and warm demeanor. Laughs were shared, tears were shed, as a dear friend, a beloved sister, was bid farewell. BBC Royal Correspondent Jeannie Bond read from lyrics written by Christina Rossetti in 1848. I shall not see the shadows, I shall not feel the rain, I shall not hear the nightingale sing on as if in pain, and dreaming through the twilight that doth not rise nor set, happily I may remember, and happily may forget. Her co-presenter on Crime Watch UK, Nick Ross, told the story of how Dando would take off her high heels for the final shot of the show, so that each presenter would appear equal in height and thus none more important than the other. It was little things such as this that made Dando so lovable. She'd never stop thinking of others. Nick Ross would go on to propose the founding of an academic institute in Jill's name, raising over £1 million for the Jill Dando Institute of Crime Science at University College London. The BBC also set up a bursary award in Dando's memory, funding one student each year to study broadcast journalism at University College Falmouth. The impact of Dando's life and legacy are evident. Even 20 years after her death, she is remembered fondly by the public that so richly adored her. A memorial garden designed and realized by the BBC Television Ground Force team in Dando's memory, using plants and colors that were special to her, is located within Grove Park, Weston-super-Mare. The site is beautiful, a fitting tribute to her memory, but gazing upon such a serene, colorful, sunlit scene, you realize it stands in stark contrast with the manner in which she died, in an ugly, convoluted, mysterious way, the reasons for which remain firmly in the dark. For those that loved her, those that worked with her, and those with a general interest in unsolved mysteries, one question still remains unanswered, clawing at the minds of the curious. Just who exactly killed Jill Dando?
Britain's most important unsolved cases. Now live, you can help solve them.